Right, hi, I'm Dr. Malcolm Ryan,
And I'm Dr. Dan Staines.
and today we're going to be giving you a talk about four lenses for designing morally engaging games. We've been doing research in the design of ethically engaging video games, drawing on lessons from moral psychology, and we want to share that with you today. So briefly, before we begin, who are we? So like I said, I'm Dr. Malcolm Ryan. I am the leader of the Game Design Development Program in the Department of Computing at Macquarie University. I am the one here with the red and purple hair. And I also have a private games company, Words on Play, where I produced a couple of games. My colleague in the photo above is Dr. Paul Formosa, who isn't part of this video, but it will be here for answering questions. Paul works in the Center for Agency, Values and Ethics, which is part of the Department of Philosophy at Macquarie University. And finally, the third member is Dan, who will introduce himself.
Hey, I'm Dan Staines. So I'm a game scholar and critic. I worked in game magazines for about 20 years, finished my PhD in 2016, did a postdoc at Concordia, which you can see the logo for there, and now I work for AIE doing game design stuff there.
So briefly give you an idea of, just put our credentials on the table. We've published, between us, we've published a couple of different games. You can talk about PAP.
All right, so Paparazzi is a visual novel game that I made while doing my postdoc at Concordia. The basic idea behind the project was that we wanted to make a game that would make people morally uncomfortable and encourage them to make morally dubious decisions. And so, yeah, we decided to make a visual novel using the RenPy engine that looks at the world of sleazy tabloid journalism.
Cool. So one of my games, The Road, is actually a tabletop card game. This is set in a post-zombie apocalypse in outback Australia. And again, similar themes, we're interested in examining the sort of ethical conundrums between players, and the game deliberately sets up difficult ethical choices for players to make. Two other research games that we're working on. So we've just finished a project on a game called The Great Fire, which is, again, a visual novel game set in sort of 1940s cinema in outback Australia. And it has a very noir theme. And this is we're examining the effect of, for example, having morality meters and other such design interventions on how people make moral choices in games. Finally, we have a game which currently has the working title of Cybercorp, which is in development, and this is just a screenshot from the storyboards of the game. This is planned to be a training game for cybersecurity students who want to be learning about the kind of ethics that are involved in doing cybersecurity. And so this, again, will be sort of in the style of a visual novel game, but a bit more sophisticated than that. But it'll be introducing concepts of ethical concepts from cybersecurity. So as well as our games, we've been doing research in this area for at least 10 years now, and we've published a variety of different papers. So here are a couple of them. This talk, we're mostly going to be focusing on work from our 2017 paper, Focus, Sensitivity, Judgment and Action. But yeah, we've been doing this stuff for a while, both empirical research and sort of more theoretical research. So if you're interested in following these up, I'll have links to where you can read some of our work later. So what are we talking about? So there are really a bunch of different kind of ways we can talk about the relationship between ethics and games. And so we could be talking about ethics in game production and ethical processes for making games, but that's not what we're here to talk about. We're more interested in the questions of ethical questions that arise during play. Ethical questions arise when you're playing the game. And there's really two different perspectives on this that we could be taking. There's player ethics, the ethics of interacting in a multiplayer game, and then there's player game ethics, ethics of interacting with NPCs and other elements in a game. And in this talk, we're particularly going to be focusing on this final idea of player game ethics. So we're mostly going to be thinking about single player games and how players make ethical decisions and how we can lead players into making more interesting and more complex ethical decisions in our games. These other topics, there's a lot of other material we can point you towards if you're interested. So why care about ethics at all? Why do we want ethics in our games? And so I want to present this as the tale of two zombie shooters. So this is an idea I'm drawing from Aristotle's work, where he talks about the difference between hedonic or hedonia and eudaimonia, which are nice philosophical sounding Greek words. They're two different kinds of pleasure, you could say. And I like to equate them to sort of two different kinds of zombie shooters. So on the Left 4 Dead is what I would call a hedonic zombie shooter. The pleasure, hedonic pleasure is visceral pleasure. It's just in self-indulgence, you know, and so Left 4 Dead is a very hedonically enjoyable game. It's just fun to run around and blow things away and just enjoy the excitement of that. Contrast this to The Walking Dead, which is what I call a eudaimonic pleasure, where The Walking Dead is not a fun running around killing things game. The Walking Dead is a dark and difficult story, and navigating choices in The Walking Dead presents you with a lot of challenging ethical decisions to make. And so this is where we talk about eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is less about that just sort of raw, visceral, enjoyable pleasure, and more about the difficulty of growing as a human being, if you like. At the end of the day, eudaimonia is about becoming better people. And this is the idea that games, in a way, can let us explore what it means to be human beings through narrative and through the choices we're making. And it's particularly interesting here in why there's this meeting between ethics and games, because games of all our media have a unique ability to give us put choices in our hands. So rather than just watching a character struggle with an ethical decision, we actually have to make the ethical decision ourselves, and we have to live with the consequences. And this, while it's not necessarily fun in a lighthearted, enjoyable, challenging sense, is deeply interesting. And, you know, a lot of our media is about engaging with these sort of difficult, challenging, what does it mean to be a human being kind of problems. And I think games are uniquely suited to be able to do that because of the interactivity. At the same time, there are a number of particular challenges that arise in designing games, which in order to create these kind of moral interactions. And those are the sorts of things we want to talk about today. So I'll leave it to Dan.
All right, so as Malcolm said in one of the first slides, a lot of our work is derived from moral psychology. And moral psychology it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a branch of psychology that's more or less exclusively focused on moral functioning, our ability to make moral decisions and what influences our ability to make moral decisions, and moral development, which is this idea that, you know, basically people get better at making moral decisions and being moral people as they go through life and learn new things. And so one of the sort of big paradigms within moral psychology, there are a few competing paradigms, but one of the sort of major ones, and the one that we draw from most prominently, is called the 4-component model. And so the 4-component model was proposed by James Rest in 1983, basically after he looked at the literature on moral psychology and looked at the various empirical studies and used the data from that to come up with basically 4 components or 4 sort of elements that comprise moral behavior in most people. And so, as it says on the slide here, there are 4 broad categories of cognitive affective capabilities. And so when we say that these are cognitive and affective capabilities, basically what we mean is that people have to think about these things and they also have to feel them as well. Morality for a long time was considered the sort of sole domain of reason. You know, basically your ability to reason about ethical problems was regarded as your moral competence in a sense. But as the discipline has sort of developed, we've discovered that emotion plays a very big role in moral judgment and the various sort of moral aspects of life. And so the 4 components, sort of just going through them briefly, we'll talk about them in a little bit more detail in the subsequent slides. But so moral focus is essentially this idea that you prioritize your moral judgments. If you're faced with an ethical dilemma, you prioritize moral reasons for actions rather than, say, pragmatic or selfish reasons for action. Moral sensitivity is our ability to recognize moral problems. You know, moral dilemmas and moral issues in real life aren't typically signposted. You know, we aren't told, hey, by the way, this is a moral decision you have to make. We have to recognize the morality in our everyday decisions that we make. And that's essentially what moral sensitivity is all about. Moral judgment is probably the one that most people are familiar with in terms of the components. Judgment refers to our ability to actually make moral decisions, to reason about morality and think about morality in terms of codes and in terms of rules and in terms of ethical systems. And finally, moral action is basically putting all of the previous 3 components into action. At it's the doing part of morality. It involves sort of perseverance, and it involves sticking to it, and basically being moral in the face of adversity. And so what we've done with these 4 components is basically we've taken them and we've used them as the basis to construct what are called lenses. And so if you're familiar with Jesse Schell's very famous The Art of Game Design book, pictures there, he talks about lenses as these sort of ideas, these sort of frameworks for interrogating and for questioning. They're not blueprints for design per se. Basically, they're just ways of looking at design problems in sort of interesting fashions, or fashions that you might not ordinarily do as a designer. Basically, yeah, they're a framework for thinking about game design, not a blueprint or a plan for doing game design. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to go through each of the lenses that have been informed by the previously mentioned 4 components, and basically just talk about them and talk about how they've been implemented in certain games, and the sort of questions and problems that you can pose as designers to maybe help you implement mechanics that are informed by these lenses. And so basically the lens of moral judgment, the primary question here that you want to ask yourself when you're designing moral judgment into your game, when you're designing moral dilemmas essentially, is how does the player choose what to do? And so there are a couple design challenges associated with this. The primary one, this is becoming less prominent now, but it used to be a big deal in games maybe 5 or 10 years ago. It's basically this idea of temptations versus dilemmas. So a moral temptation is not a moral dilemma. A moral temptation is a scenario where you have a clearly correct answer to a moral scenario, a clearly right thing to do, morally speaking, and then a clearly wrong thing to do, morally speaking. And the wrong thing typically comes with some kind of reward that you get as a result of doing the wrong thing. So for example, the picture to the left you can see is from Fallout 3, and a very famous sort of example of a temptation from Fallout 3 is the megaton quest that you get when you first start the game. And so the basic idea here is that you're this sole survivor in a wasteland, if you've never played Fallout before, and you go to this town called Megaton, which is built around a deactivated atom bomb. And while you're exploring town, you meet this guy in the picture here, Mr. Burke, and he's basically this insidious, purring, evil dude. And he says to you, hey, I'll give you a bunch of money and, a bunch of rewards if you activate the atom bomb and destroy this town for reasons that are personal to me. And so that's a very obvious temptation, right? Like clearly it's wrong to detonate an atom bomb in the middle of a populated town, but the game offers you a reward as a means of kind of inducing you to do that. Now, the trick with designing a good temptation like this is to, first of all, make the reward good enough to actually, justify the horrible thing that you're doing. If you're not rewarding the player appropriately, then there's no incentive for them to be terrible. And second of all, what you want to do is basically provide scope for the player to be able to justify the fact that they're doing the wrong thing to themselves. The megaton temptation in Fallout 3 is not a very good example of this because honestly, it's really, really difficult to somehow justify to yourself that you're blowing up a town full of innocent people. With regard to dilemmas, a dilemma is different from a temptation in that a dilemma is you have 2 sides of an issue and both of them have legitimate moral cases to make. And so choosing between them isn't a matter of just choosing between right and wrong. It's a matter of choosing right and also right, or maybe wrong and also wrong. And so a good example of a dilemma is again in Fallout 3, where you go to a town called Oasis and you find a tree there, basically a sentient tree that's sustaining this town with its magical tree powers. And basically what happens is that the tree is sick of being alive and it asks you to more or less euthanize it. But if you do euthanize the tree and grant its wish to die, then what happens is that basically the town, Oasis, dies as a result because the tree won't be there to sustain it. So you have a genuine dilemma there, right? You have 2 moral cases to make there. It's not just a matter of you deciding whether or not to be selfish. Another design challenge with respect to moral judgment is ethical continuity. And basically that's the idea that once you make a decision, that's not the end of the moral issues for the player. So what you'll typically find in moral judgment scenarios in video games where players are asked to confront a moral dilemma is that they'll resolve the moral dilemma by usually choosing some sort of dialogue choice. And then that moral dilemma and the issues that it sort of comes packaged with are never mentioned in the game again. And that's the dilemma. Whereas in real life, in moral decision making and in fiction that does moral decision making really well, what you find is that decisions lead to other decisions. And so, there's no such thing as an isolated moral decision, because the consequences have consequences, and that leads to further judgments on the part of the player or whoever is involved in the dilemma. And that's something that you don't see very typically in video games, I think partially because it's kind of a production issue. Like, it's very difficult to be able to, link all these things together when you're working with, say, multiple writers across a big team or something like that. And ethical continuity kind of leads to the next kind of design challenge, which is this idea of aggregation of choices. And this is essentially the same idea. It's not ethics in the real world, and interesting ethical decisions, we think, are not just these big one-off decisions that you make that either resolve the issue completely or, make it worse somehow. In real life, when you're making ethical decisions, what you'll typically find is that ethical standpoints and ethical consequences are the result of hundreds or, maybe even thousands of tiny little choices that you make over the course of your life, or in the case of video games, over the course of a game. And these sort of add up over time to kind of define the sort of moral person that you are, and define the kind of moral judgments that you're making. And it's worth noting too that even though we're using Fallout 3 as an example here, Fallout 3 is a really good example because it has very strong elements of dilemmas and temptations. This kind of pattern of basically giving the player a dilemma and having them make two choices and then the dilemma resolving forever is something that you see in modern RPGs as well all the time. So for example, The Outer Worlds by Obsidian, which was released just last year, has more or less the same setup with respect to moral dilemmas as Fallout 3 and New Vegas and all those games. And so does stuff like Mass Effect Andromeda. So I mean, it's an old way of doing morality in video games. Like, this kind of stuff has been around since Ultima 4 back in the 80s, but it's still quite common and quite prevalent. All right, so when you're thinking about moral judgment in games, and when you're thinking about implementing moral judgment content in your games, you have to ask, again, how does the player choose what to do? And you also have to consider some of the following questions. So first one is, what kind of moral choices are you asking the player to make? We just covered this. Are they temptations or dilemmas? If you really want the players to have to sort of sit down and think out the decisions that they're going to make, if you want these choices to be hard, then by and large, you kind of have to make them dilemmas. Not necessarily. You can do good temptations, as I said, if you manage to make the reward and the sort of self-justifications that the player makes themselves plausible. But by and large, if you want to do interesting, challenging moral judgment content, then you're going to go for dilemmas. When you're thinking about dilemmas in games, and when you're thinking about putting dilemmas into your games, try and think about what sort of codes and ethical norms a player can rely on to help make moral judgments. So for example, when we make moral judgments in the real world, very often it's within the context of us performing some sort of role. So for example, we're doing our job and we're faced with a decision that is ethically relevant to our job. And what we do is, as a consequence, is we tend to draw on codes like things like standards of professional conduct, and even things like meta-ethical systems like consequentialism or deontology to make those decisions. And so in video games, what you typically find is that players will be playing some sort of role, but there won't be any kind of hint of the sort of codes or expectations or the professional conduct that's kind of associated with those roles. And putting that stuff in can help players sort of contextualize the decisions that they're making and make the moral decisions more interesting. You can also sort of think about how the process of making a moral judgment is represented. So like I said, moral judgments are typically represented in video games via dialogue choices. So for example, someone will come up to you and say, I have this problem. Here are two dialogue choices that represent two distinct moral courses of action. Choose one. And that's fine. Like, that's fine, particularly if you're not super interested in doing like a morally sophisticated game. If you're more interested in just facilitating role play, then that kind of stuff is fine. But if you're more interested in doing kind of a little more subtle, a little more sophisticated stuff, then you've got to think about how players can actually make moral judgments in your game, and whether or not you're just providing them a binary choice in dialogue, or if maybe there's some other way that you can allow them to make their choices, either through just direct action or some other way. And finally, you want to sort of think about how difficult to understand and resolve the moral dilemmas are. So moral dilemmas are not all equally easy to resolve, and moral problems are not, we're not all equally capable of resolving moral judgment issues, basically. Like, you get better at this as you practice it. And so as game designers, what we can do to sort of make our moral judgments more interesting and get the players to basically be better at it is to treat it more or less like any other mechanic in your game, and to teach the players how to make these decisions, to scaffold them so that maybe the decisions as you go through the game deal with the same issues, but they become progressively more complex. as the game goes on, and they snowball into other decisions, as we were talking about before with the sort of aggregate of choices. And so you need to think about that. You can't just give the player a really difficult moral dilemma right out of the gate and expect them to A, care about it, and B, be able to think about it in a way that allows them to solve it intelligently. And so you need to sort of scaffold this stuff and to teach the player how to think ethically before you start asking them to think ethically. So the second lens that I'm going to talk about is the lens of moral action. And this is a tricky one. It's tricky in the real world, but it's especially tricky in video games. Basically, what it asks is, how does the player put their choices into effect? So we just talked about, this idea of, you're presented with a dialogue choice, you choose one of those choices, and then the dilemma ultimately resolves straight away. But that's not what moral action is all about. As we sort of talked about when we were discussing the lenses, moral action is about committing to a choice, being long-term moral rather than just making a short-term decision and moving on. It's about choosing versus doing. It's about acting out morality, not just making decisions about it, not just thinking about it, but actually being a moral person in your everyday life. And so what you'll often find in the real world is that moral action is all about sort of danger and resolve and bravery. It's about people like, for example, Martin Luther King or Gandhi or any of these other sort of, moral exemplar leaders. Jesus Christ is another one. It's about committing to morality, making the right choices, and doing it in the face of opposition, doing it in the face very often of, death threats and eventually just assassination. It's a matter of being moral even when it isn't easy. And oftentimes being moral isn't easy. And so if we can represent that in video games, then we're representing a fairly interesting and fairly significant component of what it means to be moral. And finally, another design challenge that's associated with the lens of moral action is social skills, leadership, empathy. These are the practical components of being a moral person. As I said, it's not just about being able to make decisions, it's about being able to turn those decisions into action. And social skills and leadership and empathy are all things that allow you to do that. And that's why you find, say, for example, with professional ethics courses, they tend to emphasize these kind of skills. They tend to emphasize your ability to talk to people, to lead them, and to convince them that you're doing the right thing. And so these are things that we could also consider in terms of designing moral content for our games. So to the right here, you can see a picture of Undertale by Toby Fox. Undertale is a 2D sort of throwback SNES-like RPG that's sort of, it's fairly simple, but basically it has this very interesting mechanic where you can see to the right here, this is a battle screen. And so, you have turn-based battles, and what you can see to the right is that down the bottom below the little text box is you've got this mercy button. And this appears every time you get in a combat counter in Undertale. And basically every time you fight a monster in Undertale, you have the option to show them mercy. And usually you'll have to complete like a little mini game or some such, and the battle will end and the monster won't be killed. You'll show it mercy. But as a result of showing monsters mercy, you don't get any XP. You don't level up. And so if you want to keep doing this throughout the entire game, this becomes progressively more difficult as the monsters are leveling up, the monsters are getting stronger, but you're staying the same because you're not earning XP from combat. And so this is a really good example of moral action and effect. Again, it's not just one decision that the player has to make. It's a bunch of little decisions that they have to make just as in the process of playing the game. And as it gets through the game, as I said, these decisions, this choice to spare monsters becomes progressively more difficult because the monsters are getting stronger and you're not. So when you're thinking about doing moral action in game, and as I said, it's difficult to implement. I mean, obviously, judgment is fairly straightforward, like we said, if you want to just do the dialogue route, but how do you implement this kind of moral action in game? So basically you have to ask yourself, like we said, is the moral problem solved once the choice is made? Are you doing these one-off big moral decisions, or does the player actually have to do something once the choice is made? So for example, in Undertale, yeah, you can choose not to fight these creatures and to spare them. But in order to put that into action, in order to actually have to do it, you have to, first of all, spare them, click the little mercy button, and then you have to do the mini games, which get progressively harder. And then you have to keep doing this over the course of the game, which, as I said, gets progressively harder as the monsters get stronger and you don't. And this feeds into the sort of second question that you should ask yourself when you're designing moral action content for games, which is how difficult is it for the player to achieve what they want? I mean, you know, you want to sort of take into account general sort of game design principles here, right? Like you don't want to make it too frustrating for the player to be able to do what they want, to make the right choice. But you also don't want to make it so easy that the choice is effectively meaningless. If the player isn't asked to sort of sacrifice something or to do something or to be challenged with something, then essentially you're just doing the dialogue choices that we were talking about previously. And then you have to ask yourself what skills are needed to do the job, and how are these skills represented in your mechanics? Does the player actually have the ability to put their moral choices into action? What kind of mechanics are available to them? What kind of actions and verbs are available to them to be able to act morally within the game world that you've set up? You have to ask yourself, does moral action require perseverance and persistence? And this sort of leads back to what I was talking about before with Undertale. Basically, if you want to do the right thing, you have to persist with it, and you have to sort of bear the costs that increase over the course of the game. And then finally, you want to ask yourself, is there an opportunity for the player to back out of their choice? Very often when we make, you know, decisions in real life, it's not a matter of I made the choice and that is it forever. That is the choice that I'm stuck with. Very often, you know, people can negotiate these things. They can say, oh, actually, you know what, on second thought, now that I've seen more information, now that I've spoken to more people, maybe this isn't the right choice for me. And so you have to be able to give the player the ability to sort of cancel it, to say, all right, you know, this isn't what I want to do. And again, Undertale does that using the sort of aggregate of choices thing that we're talking about, in that every battle that you have with a monster in this game is an opportunity to back out, to basically say, you know what, not having any XP and not leveling up is getting too hard for me. I just want to keep doing this game as I, you know, just normally. And so you need to provide that kind of, that scope for the players to do that. And yeah, and now I'll hand it back over to you, Malcolm, and you can talk about moral sensitivity.
Okay, well, actually, I'm going to talk about moral focus. So the lens of moral focus asks the basic question, so why is morality a priority to the player in the first place? And this is one of the more challenging things to get the player into this mode where they're thinking about the game in moral terms. A lot of our gameplay is inherently amoral. We put the player in, you know, a lot of games depict morally complicated situations, but depict them in a way that we just don't engage with the morality at all. And we are happy to run around killing things without thinking about that. And that's fine if that's your goal. But if you want players to engage morally with your work, you need to actually design the game in a way that draws them into that and prioritizes morality as something the player should be caring about. And so, you know, in the theory, we talk about the difference between reactive and reflective play. And reactive play is this kind of instrumental play where we're just regarding the game as a system to be optimized, and we have some win condition, and we're doing whatever it takes in order to get to the win condition in the easiest possible way. And that's a standard approach to playing most games. The alternative is reflective play. Reflective play is where we actually take into account the meaning of the activity that we were doing and think we're invited to think about the greater significance of what we're doing. So, I mean, a classic example is in a game that I'm just playing right now, is I'm playing Horizon Zero Dawn, and that game, there are bandit camps, and you're meant to just go in and clear out a bandit camp and kill everybody in sight. And that's reactive play. I'm not supposed to be reflectively engaging with who these people are or why I'm killing them. They're bad people, and I kill them because it completes quests. Alternatively, there are many other parts of that game that invite me to be much more reflective on the choices that I'm making, and invite me to really consider not just is this going to help me win the game, but also is this the right thing to do. So when we want to invite reflective play, we want the player to actually prioritize coming away from the game and feeling that they have played the game well in a moral sense, not just in an instrumental sense. And this is challenging, like I said, because part of the nature of games is to kind of encourage us to engage with something that's just a system of numbers that we're trying to optimize. In fact, we talk about this. If you say you're just turning this into a game, we're just treating this like a game, we use that as an expression to mean you're just treating this as an abstract exercise that has no significance. But our games don't have to be that way. Our games can and do invite reflective play. And so, I mean, one way that we can do this is by encouraging the player to take on a moral identity, giving the player a role in the game that has some moral significance. The Walking Dead is a good example of this. In The Walking Dead, as Lee, you have a small child in your care, and that child is watching you and paying attention to the choices you make. In fact, the game quite often tells you Clementine will remember this whenever you make some choice, which gives you this constant reminder that you are, to her, some sort of moral exemplar, and that your behavior your moral choices are significant within the game. Other ways you could give the player a moral identity. You could put the player into a role where they have into a leadership position, or a natural, a role where we naturally associate some sort of morality with, or other ways of emphasizing to the player that, that they're meant to be playing as a moral person. Another way of working towards moral focus is by humanizing the characters in the game. So when we're dealing with other characters in the game, are we dealing with them as just interchangeable bandits or other kind of units that are just there to be killed and they're anonymous, or are we actually giving them a character and giving them some life? A lovely example of this from, again, talking back to Fallout 3, I remember an example. I was clearing out a bandit nest or a raider's nest in Fallout 3, and then and after I'd killed everybody in this tower, I came outside, and there, just around one side of the tower, there was a grave with a little wooden cross in it. And it suddenly made me realize the significance of what I'd just done, because somehow thinking of raiders as people who bury their dead and have some attachment to them enough that they're willing to put a little monument to someone who's died, suddenly made me realize that these were people that I had just murdered, and not just units. Or so by humanizing the characters, we can also engage our empathy with them, which will draw us into thinking more morally about how we're interacting with them. There are other ways also, through various feedback mechanisms, for example, morality meters, or through reputation meters, or through having NPCs or other characters directly give us feedback on our behavior. The challenge here is to think about what's the consequences of that feedback. A morality meters are particularly contentious here. Is the morality meter there to act to us as a moral guide, or is it something that we're just there to instrumentally optimize? So again, keep returning to Fallout. Fallout 3 had a morality meter, which was judging, giving you a kind of karma meter, which was giving you feedback on the morality of your choices. But the karma had effects in the game, instrumental effects in the game, in increasing certain stats and abilities, which then meant that maximizing the meter wasn't just a moral priority; it was actually a game priority. And so, so the reason that I would want to maybe have really high karma was the rewards that came with high karma, rather than karma itself. In fact, so the Great Fire experiment that we were just talking about, one of the things that we were looking at is how morality meters affect people's choices. And in that game, the morality meters don't have any consequence in the game. They're merely there as feedback on your choices. And the interesting thing is how players respond to that. And so some choices where there was, we gave two different versions of the game. One game where the intuitively moral things were rated as moral by the meter, and one game where the intuitively immoral things were labeled as good according to the meter. And people generally would disregard the meter, obviously, when they felt the meter was going against their own priorities. But when the meter was following their priorities, they would then build a relationship with the meter as some sort of guide. And so then when there became difficult moral dilemmas where there was no clear good and evil, the morality meter has a clear effect. If the morality meter says that a certain decision is good, then people are more likely to do that decision, but only if the morality meter has already established trust as a measure of a good moral standard. Likewise, we can get other sources of feedback. So if NPCs that we care about give us some sort of feedback on our morality, that's another way of getting the player to reflect on the choices that they made. So an example that I wanted to point to here is Darkest Dungeon, which is really interesting in terms of the tension between reactive and reflective play. Darkest Dungeon, unlike the sort of RPG games that we've been talking about so far, this is mostly sort of I guess, a roguelike kind of game. You have a squad of characters that you take into a dungeon and you're fighting against monsters. And the key thing this game has is a sanity meter, which means that the characters are slowly going insane as you're doing this. And the way there's an interesting tension here between whether you regard the units that you're sending to the dungeon as just pawns that you're sending against the monsters and you're just trying to, just as a group of stats, or whether you actually care about them as characters and care about what you're doing to them and the morality of what you're doing. Because these are, in some sense, people that you are slowly driving insane in the course of your adventure. And so the tension here is between how the game invites reactive versus reflective play. So from a reactive play point of view, managing these characters is all about thinking about maximizing their stats, picking the right characters in order to take into battle, keeping them alive and healthy, because that's a way of doing better at the game and about beating more monsters and getting further into the game. Alternatively, the reflective way of playing is thinking about these people as actual characters who have personality and who and the choices that you're making will have effects on their lives. And the way that Darkest Dungeon invites this is by giving those characters a little bit more personality. And so when you're interacting with them in the game, they produce commentary on your choices, and they get afraid and they get unwilling to do what you want them to do and other things. So they have a more independent identity from you as a player, rather than just as units that you push around on the board. And so with that sense that they have a reality of their own, and that they have and that my choices have an effect on their lives, I then have some sort of moral responsibility in order to look after them. And the ambiguity of this game, and I think it was an intentional part of the design, was to, like, for players to feel that tension between, okay, in order to win this game, I just have to sacrifice these people and I don't want to care about them, versus these little elements that keep bringing you back and keep reminding you that these are people whose lives you're playing with, and are you really willing to make the decisions that you've been making in order to win the game? So the questions that we want you to consider when making a game, thinking about moral focus, is this question of, why is morality a priority to the player? What is it in your game that's going to motivate the player to treat moral decisions as moral decisions and not as instrumental choices that lead towards winning the game? The player needs to give value to the morality itself, rather than just as a means to an end. And in this way, I think to achieve this, we somehow need to actually step back from the question of winning or losing the game, and just emphasize that morality is a thing for its own sake. Other things we think about is, well, are we offering the player an opportunity to role play a moral identity? Are we putting them in a situation where they're being encouraged to play out as someone who has a moral authority, or someone who others will look to for their moral choices? Are they being given opportunities to reflect on their behavior? And so, for example, one thing that you could, for example, do in a game like Darkest Dungeon is, it's very easy to kill lots of characters in that game, and while they are remembered in the graveyard in that game, you're not necessarily confronted with that effect. However, if later in the game you are actually made aware of, all of you're revisited, for example, by the ghosts of all the characters that you've killed along the way, you'll have a moment to reflect and think about whether or not that decision was worth it, and whether or not the lives you've sacrificed were worth the ends that you've achieved. So one thing to think about is not just making these choices and making the player, execute them, but then inviting them later to reflect on their choices. A good example from The Walking Dead is in the first episode, after you've got a choice between saving one of two characters in a QuickTime event, later on the character you save will come to you and ask you straight up, why did you choose me? And it's an opportunity for the player to think about the choices they've made and reflect on whether or not it was the moral thing for them to do. So this is also then turns to how are the consequences represented, in terms of, are the consequences just mechanical? Are they just a bunch of values that will go up and down, or are they shown in a way that actually sort of humanizes the results and lets the player see them not just as game stats which have improved, but which are effects that have happened in the lives of morally meaningful effects that have happened in the lives of other people. And finally, what does this all say about morality in your game world? is your game world a place where morality actually matters? And there are just, generally speaking, even without directly addressing the players, there's generally ways of building your world as a world where either morality does matter or doesn't matter. And you can put this into the more broadly into the scenario design as, is this a scenario, for example, the difference between, for example, Grand Theft Auto is clearly a world in which morality is not matter, where sort of anything goes. And whereas, you know, what's another example off the top of my head? I didn't plan this. I can't think. This is what happens when you go on a little side tour. Anyway, I'm not going to try to think of an example off the top of my head and move on. So finally, I want to talk about moral sensitivity. And moral sensitivity is the question of how does the player actually recognize moral significance in the world? So when there is a moral choice to be made, how is the player able to read that? Traditionally in games, we haven't been very subtle about this. Traditionally in games, when there is a moral choice, we give them a dialogue choice, which basically straight up says, here is a moral choice, what are you going to do about it? And here are your options, your options are available to you. So we really strongly signpost moral choices as being, you know, as being, here is a moral moment, now you're being asked to make a moral choice, and then when it's done, you'll go back to playing the game in a sort of normal way. On the other hand, we do have opportunities to be more subtle about that, to show a moral situation without telling the player that it is a moral situation, to give the player more opportunity to read into that and find for themselves the morality of what they're doing. This often comes down to thinking about whether we're doing scripted game design or systems-based game design. So scripted game design, typically dialogue systems or other kinds of branching narratives where the moral choices are built into particular choices within a branching narrative. It's because of the limited number of choices that we have, a limited number of choice points that we have available in those kinds of games, due to the just overwhelming size of having too many scripted choices in a game. Necessarily, those choices become fairly obvious, and the moment where you face a moral choice is often fairly heavily signposted, because it is underrepresented by maybe one or two small choices in a larger dialogue. Alternatively, systemic gameplay, so gameplay where we're more based on either an economic or physics or other kinds of systems, can allow more complex and more subtlety here, because those moments are not clearly defined as, here is the moment in which you make a moral choice. The moral choices arise out of the dynamics of the system. I didn't plan an example. Can we think of an example? So I'm going to say Papers, Please as an example of this. So Papers, Please has a number of moments, has some scripted elements, has some deliberate scenes where you are asked to make a moral choice, but there's also morality in the systems of that game, in the systems of how you're processing people, how you make money, and how you're spending that money on keeping your family alive. And some of the morality there is about, you know, prioritizing. When I'm making a particular decision, it might cost me a certain amount of money. If I choose to show leniency to somebody in that game, it might have a cost for me as the player, and that cost might mean that I then can't feed my family or can't keep the heating on at night when my son is sick. And so the morality of there isn't just presented as a single scripted moment of what do you do in this choice. The morality there is in terms of the economic system of managing my finances in a way that I can keep my family healthy while at the same time doing the right thing by the people that I'm processing in the game. Finally, moral sensitivity is also about engaging empathy. It's about thinking about other people and thinking about how the choices that we make will affect their lives. And so once again, this comes back to the idea of humanizing the other characters in the game and thinking about them not just as units, but as people whose lives we're affecting. Very interesting example of moral sensitivity in gameplay is in Firewatch by Camposanto. This is a game, so again, it's a sort of a narrative game, but it's played out in a first-person engine. And it's interesting in the sense that the moral choices in Firewatch are not the big earth-shattering kind of save the universe choices that we might encounter in other kind of role-playing games. They are what we, in the psychology literature call micro-moral. They're kind of everyday moral choices, little choices that add together to talk about, what kind of person we are. And in particular, Firewatch, the overarching theme of that game is about what kind of person are you in your relationship with your wife. you're in a difficult situation in your relationship. You've decided to take some time away, and so you're spending time alone in the forest, sort of getting your shit together. But your marriage is sort of on rocky grounds because of various difficulties in your lives. And there comes a pivotal moment in the middle of the game where the character gets to make a choice about this. But the moment is framed so subtly, you can almost entirely miss it. So throughout the game, whenever you're walking around, you can see the player avatar's hands moving around. And at the beginning of the game, the player prominently has a wedding ring on their hand, which is obviously symbolic of their marriage, their commitment to their marriage. However, as you go, you're also interacting with another woman who you're interacting with over the radio, and your relationship begins to become sort of flirtatious and funny, and there's obviously some ambiguity here about whether you're being unfaithful to your wife in this relationship. Then at a moment in the middle of the game, a sort of a key moment of the drama, you wake up one morning in the game and you're no longer wearing your wedding ring. And this isn't in any way pointed out to you. It's just you might notice that your hand is no longer, the ring is no longer on your hand. And if you look around the cabin where you're living, you can find the ring sitting on the table. And at the moment you find the ring, you have this simple option, which is to put the ring back down or to put it on. And really there's nothing more to this choice than that simple option of, well, do you put your wedding ring back on or do you put it down? And yet this is probably the most significant choice in the whole game, because this one decision about whether to put your wedding ring on or whether to leave it off is representative and symbolic of the bigger moral journey that you're taking about whether or not you're going to stay committed to your marriage or whether or not you're going to follow your new relationship with the other character in the game. And I really admire this as an effort to make a very low-key but still very significant choice. If this was in, for example, a Telltale game, this would be a dialogue option where it says, do you want to put your wedding ring back on? Yes or no, kind of thing. And you'd have, you'd really been asked, be heavily signposted as a clear moral choice. Here, you can miss this choice entirely. If you don't bother looking around your cabin, when you wake up, you may not even notice that you're not wearing your ring anymore. And even when you do find the ring, you might just put it back on automatically, or you might spend some time thinking about the significance of that. So I'm not saying every choice has to be this kind of subtlety. This is obviously a particular design choice that achieves a particular effect in Firewatch. But I think it's interesting in that we do assume that our choices need to be big scripted moments that have consequences in the game. There is actually no consequence to this decision, as far as I know, as to whether or not to to put the ring back on or to leave it off. The rest of the game, the rest of the story still plays out the same way. The significance, however, is in the player's mind as to the meaning of that act and what significance that gives to all the rest of their decisions in the game. So this is a really nice example of how we can do morality more subtly within the game and really engage the player's moral sensitivity and ask the player to judge for themselves, is this a moral situation? What are the stakes here, rather than to be given that on a plate. So the kinds of questions you want to think about when you're thinking about moral sensitivity is this question: how is moral content presented to the player? Do we signpost moral choices and make it clear that this is a moral choice to be made, or do we approach it more subtly? Do we allow the player to read their own moral choices into the game, or moral significance into the game? And then the flip side of that is, how does the player have the ability to express their moral agency, which comes back to the same questions we asked before. When we signpost the choices, when we say this is a moral choice and here is choice 1 and here is choice 2, we're giving a very sort of limited opportunity for moral agency, and we're clearly signposting the moral choices. If, however, we take this more sort of aggregation of choices approach, where a lot of small systemic choices add up to moral significance, then none of those individual choices are so clearly signposted as being morally significant. And it may be it's up to the player to realize that as they have made a series of choices throughout the game, they've also taken a moral stance along the way. Likewise, when we're talking about empathy, the representation of NPCs in the game is important. So thinking about how NPCs are presented, do they have personalities and perspective with which the players can empathize? is also an important way of engaging the players' moral sensitivity, getting them to think about how their choices affect other players within the game, and thinking about what conversely, are there elements in our game that are cueing us to dehumanize the other players, to treat them as just units to be pushed around to achieve our goal, rather than as people to be empathized with. So that's the 4 lenses, and we really could go much deeper into all of this. Like I said, we've been doing this sort of research for over 10 years now, but I thought that gives you a broad guideline of the kinds of thinking that we can draw from moral psychology and think about in terms of how we're designing our games. If you're interested in this and want to follow up more on our work, I recommend our Morality Play blog, moralityplay.org. We've got an article up there which will link to these slides and also to further readings if you're interested in this area. So thank you very much. These are our details if you're interested in getting in touch. Like I said, I'm Dr. Malcolm Ryan. Paul will also be here to answer questions, presumably, and Dan can say goodbye for Dan.
Hey, hi, sorry. Yes, goodbye. That's my email. If you have any questions, feel free to get into contact with me, and feel free to read the papers that we're going to link on the Morality Play blog. Also, one further thing that I would say, and I think we sort of address this in one of the papers that we link, is that basically, although we've talked about these 4 components as kind of separate, modular, individual things, in reality, they all kind of interlink with each other, and they are all sort of reliant on each other. And so it can pay as game designers to think about this stuff holistically. So, you can't really have moral judgment, for example, without having the sensitivity to recognize ethical decisions in the first place. And you can't put that judgment into, action without the motivation and the moral action skills to do it. And so, yeah, it just pays to think about this stuff sort of holistically. But like I said, we cover that in the papers that are linked on the Morality Play blog. So yeah, once again, really encourage you to go check that stuff out.
Thank you all.
Thank you very much.